Welcome to the Chris Endrey podcast. I'm Chris Endrey, your host. That makes sense. Look, this time last week, I put out an episode just for my patrons about the so-called international rules-based order and how it's more or less a fig leaf to legitimize the powerful doing what they will. And I'm sad to see how prescient that examination was. I kind of wish I went into more detail on it because this week we have an escalation yet again into some chicanery where Israel is looking to overthrow the Iranian state. Just cheers of applause broadly from Western backers, or at the very best, silence from many players. For example, Barack Obama has got a Nobel Peace Prize. No comment on this particular war. And yes, I thought it was a good opportunity, even though I don't want to provide a rolling update to things that, one, will be overtaken very quickly, but two, I'm not the subject matter expert in, but three, I think that are unknowable. Like there's a lot of chaos and a lot of misinformation by design. But I think that the core principles of what's occurring are worth examining, and I think I have an interesting perspective to share on together, where we can explore the background of these types of conflicts, where they might go, what they reveal about the world, and what they might mean for us as we potentially, our societies get sucked into the orbit of what's going on. So yes, thank you for joining me as always, and an extra special thanks to my Patreon patrons. None of this would exist without you, and I can't express my appreciation. If you want to join, head over to patreon.com/Endrey. All right, outside of the music, and we're away. So in case you've been living under a rock, you probably have noticed that Israel and the West more broadly have been trying to overthrow the Islamic regime of Iran for quite some time now. It was part of the so-called axis of evil of North Korea, Iraq, and Iran back in the post 9/11 2000s, where there was a big international movement to go in and root out these bad faith actors in the international scene. And ever since, it's been, anytime it's in the news, Iran, it's often to do with the nuclear program. How close are they to getting nukes? How dangerous would that be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this week, we've seen the escalation where Israel has preemptively struck to attack Iran, firstly by committing some very impressive acts of what I think can only be reasonably be called state-led terror, where they've decapitated a lot of the senior leadership of the society in an operation where they've seemingly snuck in all these weapons bases over time and then activated them so they can locally just fire off some drones from around the corner from various nuclear scientists and generals and other leaders at neighborhoods and execute them. And simultaneous to that, they've also bombed what they thought were a lot of the Iranian missile launching capacities. And there will be other stuff that's going on that will be revealed in the fullness of time, potentially not. But what it is that it's very clearly the case that Netanyahu, leading Israel, has led this strike onto Iran. They're trying to overthrow it, and they're doing everything they can also to bring America into the war. Why is this the case? Because Israel is a tiny country. Iran is a big country, and there's a couple thousand, 1,500 kilometers or something between the two of them. And as powerful as Israel is, it doesn't have the capacity to knock out Iran and collapse its society. Seemingly, they've had a crack, and that hasn't worked in the first instance. No doubt there's more assassinations and other such wonders in store around the corner, but it still remains to be seen whether that's the type of thing that will actually overthrow the Iranian society, which they're terrified will develop nuclear weapons, because that rebalances the region against Israel's favor, because currently they're the only nuclear power in the area. Local nuclear power. Obviously, there's US and French and British interests, and Russian across the Middle East. But yes, Israel. And in case you don't know this, it is the worst kept secret in international geopolitics. Israel has 100 to 200 nuclear weapons. They have since the 60s. They stole the uranium from the US to develop them. JFK was very upset about that. But what are you going to do? He didn't live to complain. Yes, so we've got this situation where Israel is terrified that Iran will have nuclear weapons, because that means that they can it means that they're much harder to bully around. If you've seen if you've seen what's happened with North Korea, and if you saw what happened with Iraq, it's deja vu in many senses, because we've got this claims of huge weapons being developed, and then what happened in Iraq through the noughties. I'm sure those of my age and older will remember, is there was this claim that we had to go in and overthrow Saddam Hussein because he had weapons of mass destruction. It seemed like it was a frail lie at the time, which is worth remembering, that it wasn't just something that we found out not to be true and then were betrayed. It felt like a frail lie at the time, which led to Andrew Wilkie, who's the current member of the Australian Parliament, resigning from his role as, I think, an ASIO intelligence analyst. He had the integrity to say, there's no evidence of this and we're going into a war for no reason, I'm getting out. And yes, we went into Iraq, a grand Western coalition, overthrew the state, killed Saddam Hussein, or tried and executed him eventually. And turns out there were no weapons of mass destruction at all. And of course, the ironic thing is, if they had nuclear weapons, we probably wouldn't have been so enthusiastic to get in there, because who knows what happens if you invade, if you put someone's back against the wall and they've got nukes in their back pocket. So Iran, it's hard to know whether it's true or not, has been close to getting nuclear weapons for a while. This is one of those funny things where they are actually signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They allow International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors into their country, and they say that they're not developing nuclear weapons. Israel, on the other hand, doesn't allow investigations, is not a party to the NPT, and for sure does have nuclear weapons, but they have the moral high ground to go in and say, yes, we're going to kill everyone we can because otherwise it's another Holocaust, etc., etc. I'm bringing up these elements because it's worth remembering that there is so much misinformation, disinformation, otherwise bad information surrounding these matters. And there always is, because the stakes are so high. The incentives for every party involved to lie down their capability, or lie up their capability, or lie up the impact of attacks, or lie down, whatever it is. The stakes are so high that you kind of need to take everything that you consume in the media with a bucket of salt. So I hope I'm not falling for too many traps myself in that today, given it's an early stage of this particular conflict. That said, there are some things that are clear and observable because they are, civilian intelligence verifies them, or they're the types of things that you can't hide anyway. And the first one of those is, it's very clear that Israel has led the attack. Donald Trump, as president, was bragging publicly. Now, whether this is true or not is again a question, but he was bragging, saying that the negotiations that they were conducting with Iran were just a ruse to allow cover for an attack. If so, that's very, very bad for the US international reputation. If not, it exposes that he's not in control of the situation and that Israel has gone kind of out on their own in striking. Either way, it's a bad look for stability and security. But what's for sure now is that America is involved. The degree to which that involvement escalates will determine how the conflict goes. It kind of wouldn't be a war without America being on the scene, would it? And so it wouldn't be the Middle East without some sort of US military involvement. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Israel has fired a bunch of rockets. Iran has responded in kind by firing a bunch of rockets and missiles into Israel. And the Americans are very involved in defending Israel currently. And they're also involved because they supply Israel with their weapons by selling them. And also they give, I think, $4 billion US in their annual budget to Israel just for existing each year. So they're very it's a unique relationship, and they're tightly connected. So as such, it's not surprising to see that there are US military assets across the Middle East that are involved in defending Israel. This is not just a US phenomenon. That the UK, France, Germany, and potentially other powers are involved. The Jordanians, perhaps even the Saudis and Egyptians are involved in supporting Israel, which is it's kind of hard to imagine. Syria as well. Syria, which I'm not sure how closely you followed this, but last month, or a month or so ago, the Syrian regime of Assad was overthrown and replaced by a man, head of ISIS, who had a $10 million US bounty on his head at the start of this year. It's hard to imagine that he's now wearing suits and shaking hands with Western leaders, but he's offered up Syrian airspace for the defense of Israel against Iranian attacks. And yes, they're trading blows in this way, and I think it's hard to say how devastating it is, because both of them have strict censorship in terms of what you can see for the impact of each of the strikes. But it seems to be the case that Israel has been surprised at the extent to which Iranian missiles are able to do damage to specific sites. And similarly, the hope for the Israelis would be that the damage that they do to Tehran would cause some sort of collapse of that society, which hasn't occurred yet. And so then the question is, will there be US involvement? Further US involvement. And the bottom line for Israel is that they probably need the Americans to be actively involved to win, assuming that their goal is to remove any capacity for the Iranians to develop nuclear materials. And this is for a few reasons, but the most important one is that Iran is a very mountainous country, and the bases that they have deep in the mountains for nuclear technology development, they can't be reached by conventional weapons. The exception to that is America has these so-called bunker busting MOABs, mother of all bombs, some huge tonnage that they can deliver, and that these can, in theory, break through and damage the areas that are unable to be reached by other conventional weapons. And even still, it's not clear that they'll be able to take out all the capacities that Iran has, given that there are probably many that aren't known, despite the obvious reach of Mossad and I guess the CIA. But it's pretty certain that Israel can't achieve this goal on their own. So the other potential goal that they have here is to achieve full regime change. And this goal is obvious if you look backwards from what Israel has been doing. They've assassinated, as I mentioned, a lot of the senior leadership, including recently, I think it slipped through the news a little bit, but they also successfully assassinated the head and deputy head of the Iranian intelligence. And there are, of course, direct propaganda calls from Netanyahu and other channels for the Iranians to rise up and overthrow their state. It's also, again, hard to see this coming off without the classic muscle of the US global regime change experts coming in with heavy bombing and potentially boots on the ground. But even then, it's not guaranteed that even they could do it. Iran is not like the other countries that the US has overthrown in the Middle East in recent years. I mean, the US, what have we got? We've got Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Iraq, of course. But Iran is different to these. It's much larger, it's much more powerful, and its terrain is different. It's not so easy to imagine how they could get there with hardware without huge consequences for the invader. And it's not clear to me that there is a domestic appetite in the US. I mean, things are already pretty ugly on the US home front, and it's hard to imagine that there's a social appetite for boxes to be coming back wrapped in American flags for the cause of overthrowing Iran on the idea that they have nuclear weapons. I mean, this isn't 2003, and information exchanges don't only occur through a few major broadcast channels to people sitting at home watching. We can see things unfold much more dynamically through social media, even if those are skewed algorithmically, et cetera, et cetera. The human-to-human connection for information is much stronger. And I think you're already seeing this with prominent US sort of outsider media channels being very critical of the idea that there would be a war, which is even perhaps more striking because none of those are from the mainstream positions. Like you would expect war to be a more divisive thing to call upon than it has been, but just goes to show the lockstep of these institutions, regardless of whether or not something is a good idea. Well, I mean, I should put my cards on the table here. I am always biased towards peace, and I always think that these things are bad ideas because what's the goal that's achievable here? They kill the Ayatollah. They collapse a society of 90 million people. And then what? A few people march in and seize control of critical resources. They get a civil war and some pliant regimes and destabilize the region. Like that's a win for perhaps psychopaths that make a lot of money from that type of exchange. But for the average American citizen, it's hard to see why there aren't more representatives of those people. Sorry, it's not hard. It's cynical to see that there aren't more representatives of those people being very, very vociferously critical of the idea that the US would have its fingerprints on this at all. Not least because it's actually it could very quickly become an own goal for the US to become embroiled in this situation because the US has a lot of soft targets across the Middle East. Like one of the downsides of putting your military bases everywhere is that you have to defend them. And Iran has displayed that they've got hypersonic missiles and other such capacities, which haven't been knocked out from the initial strikes of Israel. And there's not much that a US base sitting in Saudi Arabia can do against missile strikes. They're not equipped to defend against these sorts of things. And those, I'm not kidding. I'll bring up on the screen for those who are watching rather than listening an image of the US bases across the region. It's not one or two. It's a lot. And all those personnel are targets, and so are the hardware that they move into the area, which actually brings me to another side point, but I think an important one. The US is ramping up its material I guess in preparation, in case they do decide to become involved, at the point in which I'm recording, it's not clear the level of their involvement yet. I'm so worried that it'll be overtaken, like not worried for the sake of my podcast, but worried for the sake of humanity, that there'll be some massive escalation before this even goes out. But yes, the US is moving in the aircraft carrier Nimitz from the Pacific Fleet, slowly rolling it across over to the Gulf part of the world. And that has raised eyebrows because this aircraft carrier is also, I mean, it's a force power projection tool, and has lots of defenses, but also it is a target in the sense that if it's hit by a single hypersonic missile, you can sink a huge asset. And this particular aircraft carrier is actually slated for decommissioning anyway. It was going to be decommissioned this year, but there's a bit of a delay in the construction of its replacements. It's going to be decommissioned next year, and it's raised the eyebrows because, if there is some sort of false flag event where they sink that ship, well, then it provides a ostensible casus belli for US to jump on in and invade Iran, which is one of those things like, that sort of legitimacy when fabricated kind of seems hard to believe that we would fall for it or that it would matter so much that they would do that stuff. But it's happened again and again. I discussed this in my podcast last week, but the Gulf of Tonkin incident, if you look up that, the US at the very least knowingly exaggerated an incident to claim that they were under attack from the North Vietnamese so that they could ramp up their involvement in the Vietnam War. And, there have been attacks. I don't want to go too much down this land, but there are lots of nefarious actions intentionally conducted against people's own societies or against allied societies to generate a rationale for subsequent military operations. And this is just one of many paths into which the US might find itself escalating into the war. Hope it doesn't happen. So then what does this mean for the region and other participants? I think that's really worth looking at, because one of the beautiful things of conflict is that they're very easy to get into and very, very hard to get out of. You can imagine how a stated goal like achieving democracy in Afghanistan can begin with, okay, we'll overthrow the state and install a state and run elections and things like that. Okay, that's great, but that's not how these things work. They're dynamic cultures that are built up over time, and there are cultures that exist that are resistant, and people don't like being told what to do generally, and legitimacy is hard to attain. So across the course of 20 years, the US, however many trillion, to start off with the Taliban in Afghanistan, get rid of that, and then they end up with, of course, the Taliban in Afghanistan, plus they, in their hurry to leave, they donated them some $7 billion or something of military hardware. So now it's a Taliban that's flying around Black Hawks, etc., and using night vision goggles and whatever else. So it's very easy for this stuff to go wrong. I think it's more reasonable to think that, as foolish as our leadership can be, or as foolish as those who hold power, the hubris that they can have, I think that they still are aware of that. And I think it's an even more cynical reality, which is, okay, when Saddam Hussein was overthrown and a new Iraqi state was installed that is weak with decentralized sources of competing power and hence sort of perpetual dysfunction, I think it's fair to say that that's not a bug, that's a feature. I think that certain Western participants and Israel would love nothing more than a similar outcome in Iran, which may ostensibly be presented as, let's get rid of this oppressive theocracy and instead have a Western democracy. Oh, it doesn't work. Oh, there's backlash and whatever, and there's chaos, and they struggle to form a state. I mean, that's kind of the win, I guess, as intended, because it means that you have you don't have a functional, coherent source of power to resist whatever you want to do in the area. Now, what is it that you might want to do in the area? The obvious one is Iran has huge wealth. They're 5% or something of the global oil production. But even more importantly, 90% of that oil is currently sold to China, which is the key sort of peer rival of the US in contemporary global affairs. So being able to control that's a pretty handy win. They're also a rallying point of anti-Israel activity. I mean, Iran funds the Houthis in Yemen who fire rockets at Israeli targets. Iran funds Hezbollah, was backing the Syrian state, and these are all thorns in Israel's side. Absolutely. And not just that, they sort of statedly talk about the destruction of the Israeli state. And so, having breaking the back of that would be a huge win for the Israelis. And it seems like they are quite close to it on the one hand, closer than they have been. Yes. So also Iran is a key friend of Russia in the area. They, at the very least, have been supplying Russia with the Shahed drones and potentially other munitions in their war against Ukraine, the NATO-backed Ukraine. And so don't expect to see them absent from the exchange, especially if it escalates, because Russia has been receiving a lot of particularly domestic terror attacks against civilian targets, but also against military targets that clearly bear the fingerprint of Western involvement. They require Western involvement for the types of technologies and planning and intelligence. And so they will be probably only too enthusiastic to find soft Western targets via Iran in any subsequent military exchange, and they're there to be found. It's hard to believe, but a German aircraft of the German Luftwaffe turned on its transponders seemingly by mistake briefly and turned them back off, identifying the location of the aircraft. And I've written down the name of the aircraft so I don't get it wrong for you here. Yes, they put on the transponder of their Airbus A400M Atlas refueling tanker in the skies over Jordan. The German Defense Ministry was very quick to deny it, but it lets you know that at the very least, Germany is involved in refueling Israeli jets as they go back and forth on firing missiles onto Iran. So you can only imagine what other chicanery is occurring with the greater Western powers of France and the UK, obviously America as well. Where does this go if it's like obviously the case that Russia is behind a hypersonic missile strike on a US base or whatever else? Or furthermore, where does this go if Israel starts to lose, which is not an impossible outcome? If China considers it to be too much of a risk to their oil supply to not radically supply the Iranians with missiles, and similarly, if Russia wants to do everything they can, even though their hands are tied currently in the Ukraine, if they decide to ply Iran with a bunch of hypersonic missiles, there's no defense systems against these that work, which I think is worth stressing, because there's this idea that with the TARD and with the Iron Dome and David Sling, the various systems that they have against rockets, ballistic missiles, etc., that there are mechanisms to stop them. Hypersonic missiles can't be stopped. And the Russian recently tested the Oreshnik missile in Ukraine, and that not only can it not be stopped, but it does damage akin to a nuclear strike without a nuclear warhead. So if we start to see those sorts of weapons landing in Israel proper, the question emerges, if it hasn't already, how far are we from a nuclear strike? If there's an existential threat to Israel, you can almost be certain that there will be a nuclear exchange. How limited that is, you can never predict. But I think this is the point that I've been slowly unraveling towards since the start, is that it's very easy to escalate a conflict and it's very hard to control it. And I think we have this illusion that, well, here are our red lines, here are our ceilings, so we know what will occur. But those, as we've seen in the war between Ukraine and Russia, initially Germany's red line was, we're only going to send helmets. Now, this last month they've been talking about sending Taurus missiles. I think they kiboshed that at the last minute. It's a huge escalation from sending non-aggressive things like helmets and medical support to sending missiles that have to be programmed by a German or someone from NATO to be able to hit the target. Like that's a very slippery slope in just a couple of years. And so, do we assume that we know that we can control these conflicts and there won't be nuclear exchanges? No, absolutely not. And even if the chance on a given day is 3% instead of 1%, I mean, you run that out for 30 days, you're in big trouble. And I often think with sympathy for the people that made the doomsday clock, which counts the minutes to midnight being an all-out nuclear exchange to the end of our species, because I think they didn't put enough rungs, because we're like, I think we're like 2 minutes or 1 minute to midnight now, and they need to keep it. We keep pushing the handle of that even closer to midnight, and they can't quite capture it anymore, I think. Anyway, so yes, as I mentioned, the worst kept secret is that Israel has nuclear weapons. And if you look at the history of how well our species has done in caring for our nuclear weapons and making sure that we don't have any nonsense, It's not comforting. I mean, I think it's very easy to take the fact that we haven't had an all-out nuclear exchange as evidence that we're doing a pretty good job, and there's sensible heads in charge. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was there, and we were very close, but cooler heads prevailed, and therefore, blah blah blah. What's missing from that evidence is the amount of times that we were this close for absolutely no reason. There are so many instances of it. In fact, I've done a video on it in my YouTube channel, Second Look with Chris Endrey, that I'll link in the bottom. But some of the examples are like they tear the eyebrows from your face. Like there have been instances of nuclear weapons falling, like just being dropped from a plane by accident over North Carolina. And then, 3 out of their 4 detonation mechanisms went off, and we were just lucky that last one didn't go. And the bombs are still there because they can't figure out how to get them out of the ground. So the army just bought the land around it and grew trees. So there's a nuclear weapon just sitting there in North Carolina. There's multiple instances of planes carrying nuclear weapons crashing or dropping them on the airways and everything catching on fire. Fortunately, they don't go off. But there's only so many times we can play with this fire and get away with it. And so, yes, I hope that I don't need to add in the values statement that any exchange like this is a catastrophe. And most of the people, as always, the people who are killed by this stuff probably want nothing to do with the conflict at all. So yes, let's hope that we get lucky there, continue to get lucky. It would be also remiss of me not to at least briefly mention that Iran has been a center of great power struggles for a century now, and that there are multiple instances of democratically elected governments being overthrown by Western intervention. It is what it is. It's not a rare thing, but I think it just means that when you hear about, the horrors of the regime or social movements within of resistance, like not that those aren't legitimate or true, but the way in which they're being treated and applied is not evenly or consistent or with the interests of the Iranian people in mind, typically. We heard the same things about Saddam and the Ba'ath Party, but we don't hear the same things about the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. And regardless, I guess, if it's the case that a regime is considered to be evil or bad, where's the evidence that overthrowing them with military force leads to a better society? It's hard to think of a lot of evidence of that, but it's easy to think of a lot of evidence where we've overthrown societies, we being the West, and those societies have been dysfunctional for decades. Looking back, it's very easy to see that whatever rationale as we go in has nothing to do with what's achieved. In fact, what's more, Iran is probably a perfect example of the unintended backlash of Western intervention because, the US and the UK went in and overthrew Mossadegh and put in the Shah, whose son is coincidentally doing the rounds now as a potential a replacement waiting in the wings for the West to parachute in, which is alarming. And then, the backlash against the unpopularity of that is seen in the Islamic Revolution, where the Ayatollahs have taken power and now we have the theocracy that's there. That probably wouldn't exist without the initial intervention. So you can't control where these things go so often. And yes, we should put our thumbs on the scale of other people's lives with great care, much more care than we do. Another element that's worth considering in these exchanges is because they do occupy so much of the bandwidth, is they provide cover for all other sorts of nonsense to occur while nobody's looking. And I worry, as though that achieves anything, but prior to this escalation of the exchange of the rocket fire between Israel and Iran, it's kind of hard to put into words anymore the horror of the suffering of the poor people of Gaza. But they are at yet another inflection point prior to this with starvation and supplies not being able to be delivered of aid. And now that the eyes are elsewhere, I fear that what can only be seen as the intentional strategy of the Israelis to destroy the people there so that they can control the area and break that as a power base on their doorstep, a resistant power base. That will only be escalating, and who knows what, bulldozers they're sending in or raids they're mounting or what other horrors are occurring. So similarly, I think that there will be other parts of the world where it's a chance for bad faith actors to take out the trash, so to speak, and do the activities that they normally would be scrutinized for. I mean, it's a classic one in Australian politics where sort of tax rises will get announced on grand final day or Melbourne Cup Day or Christmas Eve or whatever. This is now a sort of global level opportunity for the same. I mean, what a great time for China to move on Taiwan, or for whatever, you name it, any sort of international crime to be committed. Which I guess leads to probably the final point that I want to make today. How much I don't want to steal too much of your time onto this. But as I discussed in my international rules-based order episode just for the Patreons, now more than ever, you can see starkly clear that there is no international rules-based order beyond power, and that power balance is shifting, which is leading to more appeals to the idea that there is an order to justify certain machinations. And this couldn't be clearer in the current war. The EU, which is I'm so embarrassed to be a citizen of in some ways, because they've spent the last 3 years on absolute moral high ground, taking every chance to attack the Russians through every international institution and through every mechanism, unprecedented sanctions and things, and all that sort of stuff. Banning athletes, all that, any kind of anything you can imagine that was Russian is persona non grata. And that's all been done under the auspices of the idea that Russia is an aggressor and that everything must be done to punish them. And now that we have an instance of a clear aggressor again with Israel, the only statement that the EU's put out is in support of Israel. There's no support. There's far be it from talk of sanctions. It's the exact opposite. It's any support required. I mean, it appears that Netanyahu visited either Cyprus or Greece this week, who are members of the International Criminal Court and didn't fulfill their treaty obligation to arrest him under that charge. Like, it just makes a mockery of all the systems that we have. And I don't say this to be smug and say that it's all rubbish and garbage or whatever. I think what we need to do is look at these systems and realize that they are, the next time that they're held up as legitimizing forces for achieving a particular outcome, I think there's the opportunity to think twice and to think, okay, well, why might that be the case? And is this something that's evenly applied? And if not, what does that mean, et cetera, et cetera. It's, as always, and I'm sorry to keep coming back to this note, but it's a bit dispiriting as members of ostensible democracies, because you really do see in these instances where these most high stakes of exchanges have nothing to do with the political will of the people who are ostensibly represented by the people who are making the decisions on our behalf. There was no support from within Australia for us to go to war with Iraq, and yet we did. I think you'd be hard pressed to say that there's support for America to go to war with Iran, despite the increasing propaganda calls from the Israeli leadership, who are saying that, well, if Iran gets nukes, it's New York that's going to be bombed after Tel Aviv, and things like that. Kind of things that are just patent nonsense. I mean, how would they even do it? One, they don't even have nuclear weapons. If they did, they wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. So there's just another reminder to be healthily skeptical of certain systems. The US itself has a law that it can only go to war via an act of Congress. Now, this hasn't been followed since, I think, Korea. So think how many wars the US has been in just in your lifetime. All of them, none of them have required acts of Congress. So that, again, absolutely undemocratic, total dictatorship behavior. And yeah, I guess just don't be sucked into the hating of people that you don't know. Sorry, it's not my job to moralize and tell you what to do. And I'm sure if you're listener of mine, you're not in that camp anyway. But yes, hopefully it's been a fun exploration for you across this topic. And any closing thoughts? I think I'll just close by saying the obvious: condemnation of any violence between people in the world. These are all constructs, fighting constructs, and very, very rarely do they represent what they claim to or serve what they need to. And hopefully we can do a job of building better constructs that serve all of us a little bit more usefully into the future. And, we're a praying man, praying for peace. All right. Love to you all wherever you are. Thanks for listening.